Hello, everyone. So I'm delighted to moderate today a panel focused on the role that the private sector and regulation can play on accelerating the energy transition. So with us today, we have Mary Schapiro. She's Vice Chair for Global Public Policy at Bloomberg. She's also Vice Chair of the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. Prior to Bloomberg, Mary has been a trailblazer working under four presidents and as the first woman chairing the SEC, the Security Exchange Commission, SEC, and the Commodities Future Trading Commission, CFTC, and the Financial Industry Regulation Authority. She also has been a leader for the past decade on driving climate disclosure requirement and regulation under the Financial Stability Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, the TCFD. So welcome, Mary. And with us as well, we have Marie-Anne Barbat-Layani. So she's the chair of the IMF, the French Market Authority, and who is obviously a long-standing leader in sustainable finance, given how Paris Financial Center has really sustainable finance in its core DNA, as she said it earlier. She has a wealth of experience on both the public and the private sector. She has worked across the financial administration, at the French Treasury, at the European Union, and the Ministry of the Economy, Finance and Industry. She has also served as Deputy CEO at Crédit Agricole, which is definitely a big task. So welcome, Marie-Anne, as well. So I hope we will cover several topics today. First, the macro outlook impact on the transition, the role of regulation in the transition to a net zero carbon economy, the role and the need for capital mobilization to accelerate the transition. So first, Marie-Anne, considering the energy crisis and the macroeconomic challenges that we have experienced and seen over the past 2 years, priorities have shifted given the inflation and many other challenges. What can we expect from investors and for corporates?
Okay, that's a difficult question, but interesting one. First of all, I'm very happy to be here and especially to have a discussion with someone who has a great importance in financial regulation, has had and still has, so I'm very honored. So it's difficult to say actually what will happen now in Europe because, as you know, we are in a situation where we don't see clearly who is going to be in charge, especially in Brussels, who is going to be the new commissioner in charge of financial services and also of energy transition. And obviously, this is going to have a major influence. And also, the parliament is fairly new. Anyway, I'm completely convinced that whatever the context is, things will not change that much, at least in the strategy and in the objectives, because to be blunt, we don't have any choice. Climate change is something that is obviously here. Nobody is questioning that anymore, I guess. And also, it's accelerating, and we know that public authorities as well as corporates and whoever has responsibility in our societies must act swiftly and efficiently to change that. So obviously then if you go into the details, the European agenda on sustainability, the Green Pact has been very strong, very rapid, and a lot of regulations have been enacted at the legislative level. We are in the process of implementing. We are also in the process of reviewing, although it's fairly new. We are aware that the general framework is not completely coherent and that also it's sometimes difficult to implement because of lack of coherencies, because of some missing parts. And so we need to look at the regulation again, even though it's fairly new. And as a regulator, of course, what we need to do is to try and make sure that it's understood, that our expectations are clear, that we accompany the private sector and the financial sector in implementing these regulations that are very new. Some call it heavy, and some also say that it's difficult to implement. By the way, even before the end of the current mandature in Brussels, there's been some changes to the way CSRD, which is the directive for corporations, will be implemented, especially the time frame for SMEs to implement has been lengthened, and also the requirements have been somehow reduced. So obviously, we are in a way in a squeeze because we all know we need to act. We need to act quickly. We have some pieces of regulations that, well, could be discussed, and certainly there will be some questions about them. But we know that we need to implement them and to do that efficiently. And on the other hand, we hear that it's costly, it creates level playing field differences for European corporations because obviously Europe is very much at the forefront and the requirements are much higher in Europe than anywhere else in the world. The standards are higher, the regulations are stronger. So we know it's difficult. We are not blind, nor deaf, so we know, and we are trying to take that into account. And like I said, we are trying to accompany. But obviously, I don't expect this to be completely abandoned because it's very much now in the European DNA. Certainly, there's going to be some more pieces of legislation to make it more coherent, or at least we hope so at the French IMF, or to make it more comprehensive and take more into account the transition, for example, the financing of the transition. But, well, we'll see, but I don't think there's going to be a major shift because the reality is just there to show us what we have to do.
Thank you. And over time, regulation should help drive credibility and good practices. So it's a journey, a transition as well. Mary, so you're based in the US, where the transition has been really driven, stimulated by the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act. And given your position, what do you think are the opportunities and the challenges of the transition? And perhaps if you could comment on what can countries do to seize such opportunity?
Sure, thank you. And let me just say how honored and pleased I am to be here, especially with my colleagues on the stage. You know, we tend to talk a lot about the risks of climate change and not nearly enough about the opportunities. But I think that the transition to a resilient net zero economy represents perhaps the biggest investment opportunity of our lifetimes. And companies that can grasp that opportunity will do very well. I think the IRA has shown us how investment can create new jobs, hundreds of thousands of new jobs in the US alone, and really has strengthened productivity and growth. In addition, the transition to renewables will give us more security and stability in our energy supply, and that should help to insulate us from geopolitical uncertainty that is really traveling around the globe, and the volatility that comes from that. And I think most significantly, the transition will help us reduce the costs of global warming, which are not insignificant, both in their human terms, but very much in financial terms as well. Swiss Re has reported that insured losses from natural catastrophes in 2023 represented $108 billion, uninsured losses of $172 billion, which brings us close to $300 billion in 1 year of losses. So really important that we tackle this. What I would say is that delivering the transition will require action by governments, by financial institutions, and by corporates. Every country needs to have a transition plan, and it needs to be embedded in their growth strategy. They need to understand what their industries and sectors need to do to transition and what kinds of investments are needed. And that sort of plan will obviously be somewhat different for every country, given their industries. And then companies and financial institutions also need to have a transition plan. It is not enough to declare that you'll be net zero by 2050. You need to show stakeholders how are you going to get there, and that needs to be public and clear and credible. And what we have seen this past year is really very heartening on that front. Over 200 financial institutions have developed transition plans and published them. We expect about 50 more this year, and we're monitoring those, and that's a huge step forward, I think.
That's a huge step and a milestone, I would say. If we move on the regulation, perhaps, Marianne, the EU has come a long way in developing, shaping sustainable finance regulations, directives, and frameworks. And France, obviously, has been a champion for many years. So with the introduction of, on one side, the CSRD, for corporates. On the other side, the SFDR regulation, which is more funds focused. How do you see firms in France adapting? What are the best practices that you have seen perhaps emerge? And then on the other side, how is the IMF, well, first maybe assessing the players in the market and supporting them?
Thank you. Well, you mentioned two very important pieces of regulations. There are several more, because we are not short of regulation in Europe concerning sustainable finance, and everything fits into their small pieces. But like I said, there's still a need to trim it and probably make it more coherent and fill some holes. But anyway, yes, we have these two chunks, big chunks of regulations to implement for us regulators, which is, by the way, also a challenge, and a challenge that we've been preparing for a few years now. First of all, because the French IMF has been an involved regulator for many years, and we have trained our staff, and we have also our own national guidelines, regulations, and doctrines that have, by the way, contributed to shaping the European framework, but also help us to develop this completely new competence for a regulator. And also, to a certain extent, and this would need to go into much more details, but for example, you mentioned CSRD, which is the issuers, big corporations first, then smaller ones, a directive. This one is, to a certain extent, a little bit prepared by some regulations that pre-existed in France, whereby large listed companies had to publish what we call DPEF, which is somehow pre-sustainability report that is required by CSRD. There's a huge difference between the two. The level of requirements and the level of accuracy is very different, but still it's more or less prepared to try and start answering your question. That being said, it's obvious that it's a big challenge for everybody. I mentioned the regulators' challenge, but also it's a big challenge for companies. Well, this is a very important year, because the first implementation year is going to be 2025 for large listed companies, CSRD, and so it's for the 2024 accounts. So, talking about CSRD, what can we do to help and prepare? Like I said, we can capitalize on previous regulations that existed, especially at a national level. And also what we are doing very much is try and publish what our expectations are going to be as a regulator. So we did a lot. We published, for example, in the spring, a report on transition plan, a guide for large corporations to prepare their sustainability reporting. We also published a lot of reports or the results of non-sanctioning, non-enforcement controls, which is a tool that IMF has been developing as a regulator for a few years. And in these publications, what we do is to identify good and bad practices. By the way, this is also a way for the regulator to become more competent, because when we find good practices, bad practices also, by the way, but when we find good practices within some corporations, it can be also basis for us to develop our own expectations. And in any case, we have made all these publications. Obviously, we are doing a lot of, we are having a lot of exchanges with the corporations that are going to implement CSRD to try and make this transition as smooth as possible. Also, obviously, we are not, I'm not saying that we are not going to use all our tools and powers, but the objective is obviously not to try and enforce and reach sanctions rapidly on CSRD. That's not the way we see things. We know it's difficult. We know it's a growing project, collective project, and we are going to accompany and then maybe, if necessary, of course, use all our other tools, including sanctions if necessary. As regards SFDR, it's slightly different because it's obviously more focused on sustainability, but it's also a question of something that is more traditional for market regulators, which is to have a fair, transparent, accurate information given to the investors. And there we have been in this accompanying stance, and we still are, but we have also made it very clear at the beginning of this year that we are going to be a little bit stronger in the enforcement, because it's been a few years now that this type of subjects are on the table. And we have this year also, for the first time, we have had a sanction in our enforcement policy for an asset management firm that had been doing what is commonly called greenwashing. So we don't want that, because we know that what is really highly needed in this field is also, if you want to channel the investments and make them happen, you have to have confidence. So not only do we have to have commitments by the issuers and the asset managers, but we need to make sure that this is checked and controlled and accurate. And so first sanction this year for greenwashing, also because we need to use all our tools and make sure that things are for the customers and investors, that they can be confident that when they invest in something that is green, it is really
actually green. Thank
exactly.
you. Credibility. Thank you. Mary, how do you see international cooperation then evolving to ensure consistent implementation? We just talked about France, but there are many standards across different jurisdictions. And what more is needed?
So we'll never have, in my view, regulation that's identical across the globe. It's just not going to happen. But that doesn't mean regulatory cooperation isn't really critical, especially for multinational companies that are doing business in many jurisdictions. But it's also important for investors that they get information that's roughly comparable across jurisdictions in order to make good decisions about investing. So I think there are really two critical pieces to this. One is the disclosure of climate risks and opportunities, and the second is the transition plans that I just mentioned for those net zero committed companies and financial institutions. On the climate risk disclosure side, there's been a huge amount of progress made. The Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures issued in 2017 a framework for climate risk disclosure that is now been adopted in 20 jurisdictions. It's the basis for the ISSB's climate risk disclosure standards. It covers 55% of global GDP. It covers more than 50% of global emissions, and it covers 40% of total market cap globally. So really applaud the regulators for making tremendous progress in an area that was a source of frustration for investors in particular, who weren't getting comparable information about a car company in Germany and France and the US and Japan, and thanks to this effort will. I hope that transition plans can follow the same path, that regulators will take up, hopefully, the basic framework developed by GFANZ and utilize that as a foundation for their mandating of transition plans over time.
Comparability. Thank you, Mary. And perhaps could we ask you maybe two more questions there then? So how do you see the role of coalitions such as GFANZ that you just mentioned evolve in the next few years to really accelerate such ambition to align, coordinate initiatives and regulations?
Sure. So, you know, coming out of the financial crisis, I think there was a reluctance of regulators to really work closely with industry as opposed to overseeing industry. And I think we've come through a period recently where we've discovered that private sector coalitions can actually help accelerate regulation and make the job of the regulators a little bit easy. When firms sign up for voluntary initiatives like the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, and thousands of companies voluntarily determined that they would make disclosure under that regime, it made it much easier for those 20 jurisdictions to say, we've seen it, it works, it satisfies the needs of investors, it works for the private sector, we'll go ahead and mandate it. Because ultimately, voluntary initiatives are great, but they can't survive forever. They need to have mandatory regulation behind them. So I think, again, the same thing is starting to happen with transition plans. The GFANZ framework was developed by the private sector, but it's now becoming sort of the basis in the UK and Hong Kong, in the US for further work on transition plans. So I think the real benefit of these private sector coalitions is that they can help accelerate and inform what policymakers ultimately need to do.
Thank you. I believe there is another initiative, and sorry for the acronyms, the Net Zero Data Public Utility Initiative that you've been working on with actually the French government, and Mike Bloomberg and Emmanuel Macron came together with this. Could you maybe share with us some insights?
Sure. So one of the things we've heard most from financial institutions is a lack of access to information about portfolio companies' greenhouse gas emissions. So President Macron and Mike Bloomberg about 2 years ago decided this was a problem we could solve. And they determined to develop a net zero data public utility. I know the abbreviation is horrible, but the NZDPU is being built. Proof of concept was unveiled at COP last year with just about 400 or 500 companies' data in it. The development of the system is being funded by Bloomberg Philanthropies, but it's overseen by the Climate Data Steering Committee, the CDSC, yet another acronym. But importantly, that is an organization of policymakers from around the world. So Bruno Le Maire represented France on it, the NGFS, IOSCO, Financial Stability Board, UK regulators, about 25 public policy members on the CDSC, and they make the decisions about what data should be included, what's the data model that's the best. They're starting with greenhouse gas emissions, scope 1, 2, and 3, adding to that emissions reduction targets for companies, and then the use of carbon offsets or credits. And we will are working on the production model of the NZDPU right now, and hopefully we'll reveal that at the end of this year with thousands of companies included, and then we'll continue to iterate. All the data in the system will be free. All of it will be accessible to everyone. You can go to nzdpu.com right now to see the proof of concept, and then ultimately we will turn it over to the UN to run. But we view it very much as a public good and a way to fill a really big gap in the ability of policymakers to know, for example, where we are against the carbon budget, or the ability to hold accountable companies that have made net zero commitments.
Comparing peers, so the NZDPU. So maybe to conclude, if you both could give us maybe a 1-minute response on mobilizing capital. So maybe Marianne, the question could be, what measures are being taken to really attract green investment in France, in Paris? And maybe for you, Mary, what do you think are necessary steps to help mobilize capital more effectively globally to transition project? 1 minute.
This is 1 minute for hundreds of billions, because as we all know, and it's just been reminded by the Draghi report that's just been published, we need huge amounts of money in Europe. Well, not only in Europe, but this is what he was working upon. So we need money. We need more money, much more money, hundreds of billions more of financing that what we currently have on average to finance the double transition. I heard the previous roundtable. We were talking about innovation and digitalization. This needs a lot of money and a lot of investments. It's the same for the energy transition. So huge amounts of money are needed. And not only that, but we now know that we also need huge amount of money to finance the defense of Europe, because Europe needs to rebuild more defensive capacity. All this needs a lot of money, and this is the reason why the key project currently on the table, and Draghi tells it very clearly, is Capital Market Union. And we need to make sure that this old project that has become a little bit old-fashioned over the last 15 years is now hot again. And it is because there is a lot of political involvement and backing, and this has been the case for approximately 1 year, I think. So the new challenge is going to make sure that it's on top of the pile of the new people in charge in Brussels. We need to relaunch this project because we need to have more money for very good reasons, and we know that we need more financing, much more financing for European corporations, for the transitions that we need to implement.
And many instruments.
Many instruments. 1 minute is too little. I could go into more details.
No, but
less than 1 minute. One
yes.
sentence,
okay.
please.
Mary,
it's finished.
I'm done.
No,
I'm sorry.
Mary.
We need many things. We need voluntary carbon markets with high integrity. We need investment in green technologies. But I would say most importantly, we need a definition of transition finance that allows for the definition, allows for the investment in high-emitting sectors that need to be decarbonized, so that we're not just talking about investment in green, but we're talking about companies that are aligned or aligning with Paris and need investment in order to get their emissions down.
Thank you. Thank you both very much for your experience, your insights, and thank you all. Have a great forum.
Thank you, Adeline. Thank you, ladies.